Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope you're doing well. This weekend I reread The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself, first published in 1845, so it's the first of what I believe are his three autobiographies that he published during his lifetime. I have it in the Library of America's Slave Narratives anthology, which is critically valuable, and the cover portrait there is actually a Jacob Lawrence portrait of Douglass painted in 1938, so it's an imagined portrait, but you can see he's actually writing here. And that's one of the key ideas, is the whole written by himself is just pushing against that idea that Africans in general, African Americans, individuals who had grown up under slavery, non-white individuals, from a very racist perspective, couldn't learn to be literate. They did not have the developed intellect. Even some abolitionists, including Ralph Waldo Emerson in his 1822 journal entries, exhibited that idea that there was an intellectual difference. So the written by himself is a really key part. It's a reason that nearly all of these narratives that are in this anthology include written by himself, written by herself in there, to say this individual learned to become literate and able to write while being an enslaved human being. In most cases, some after they'd escaped. But it's an absolutely critical text for anybody who's interested in history and the history of the United States. And it does two things really well. As I said, it sort of pushes that idea that Douglass was intellectually capable of writing this autobiography and writing it in a very lucid, clear, thoughtful way. The other thing that it serves, and the other thing that it does incredibly well, is it serves as a categorical, clinical takedown of any mythologies or romanticism that persisted at the time and today around slavery in the United States and what that looked like, the Gone with the Wind aesthetic, if you will. So I want to talk a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to talk at the end about sort of some historical context that makes the book even more valuable. But I want to focus on the narrative first and on Douglass. So as I mentioned, it really serves as just an incredible takedown of how horrifying slavery was. There are passages in it that graphically describe the violence that was perpetrated, by slave owners, by slave overseers, by what Douglass uses the term slave breeders, because that's what they were doing. They were trying to breed enslaved children, babies that they could then, that's a certain amount of money, I can sell that slave. And it's truly horrifying. And it's not just men who do this. There are slave-owning women who, sit in their house and have something there to be able to just hit the house slave who's coming around. So I won't read those, but it is the violence is described. It's not dwelt on, but it's described. But he really goes in and sort of, as I said, demythologizes. He dispels a lot of the myths that had persisted. And again, this is sort of the major narrative written by someone whose entire life up to that point, until he escaped, had been spent as a slave. Here too, the slaves of all the other farms received their monthly allowance of food and their yearly clothing. The men and women slaves received, as their monthly allowance of food, 8 pounds of pork or its equivalent in fish, and 1 bushel of cornmeal. Their yearly clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers, like the shirts, 1 jacket, 1 pair of trousers for winter made of coarse Negro cloth, 1 pair of stockings, and 1 pair of shoes, the whole of which could not have cost more than $7. The allowance of the slave children was given to their mothers, or the old women having the care of them. The children unable to work in the field had neither shoes, stockings, jackets, nor trousers given to them. Their clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts per year. When these failed them, they went naked until their next allowance day. Children from 7 to 10 years old of both sexes, almost naked, might be seen at all seasons of the year. There were no beds given the slaves, unless 1 coarse blanket be considered such, and none but the men and women had these. And it continues, where he's describing, that's chapter 2, where he's describing what daily life was like, and that, the idea that any of these human beings who were held in bondage were being taken care of was absolute, just an absolute lie perpetrated. He then goes in And this is where he starts to get really clinical with his. He had escaped 6 or 7 years before he actually wrote the narrative, and so he was aware, having spoken at some abolitionist meetings and such, he was aware of what sort of BS was advanced to say, well, slavery's not so bad, or oh, they can't do, or look at them, all this stuff. And so he becomes very clinical around, like, he introduces these ideas in his narrative where he shows, like, this is an incident from my life that shows that this other piece is untrue. So he talks about on the plantation where he'd worked, one of the people he worked with, it was such a large plantation, some of the slaves had never seen the actual, like, main slave owner. And so one of them was walking, from one edge to another one day and met a white guy coming by. And he, the white guy started asking him some questions. He said, yeah, he goes, I guess it could be worse, but it's not that great. And kind of complained about some of the living conditions, which were just described for us. Well, that man was the slave owner. About, a couple days later, he figured out who the slave was and had him sold down to Georgia from the plantation there where they were in Maryland. It being sort of regarded as the farther away from the north you go, it's harder to escape, and there's more violence towards the slaves. And so, like, Douglas then turns around and says, this is my example for why you have to be very careful to say, like, oh, we talked to some slaves and they said life is okay, they don't want anything else. What do you think is going to happen to them if they say, no, this is horrible? My brother was whipped in front of me the other day. This violence occurred. All these things. He goes, they can't tell the truth about anything because they know they'll be tortured. These are all of the things that will happen to them. So he's very clear around that. And he's very clear around, this is not just violence that's directed towards men, it's directed towards women. It's not just violence perpetrated by men, it's violence perpetrated by women. He goes on to describe how there's a policy of if, once on some of the plantations, they take the babies that are born to the female slaves and they take them to the other side of the plantation or another farm, and they have some old woman, who can't work in the fields anymore, take care of the babies so that there will be no, like, family bond between these human beings. So, like, it's a policy specifically designed to, dehumanize and take away even a nuclear family unit from the slaves. He goes on about policies around how some of them will intentionally, like, try to breed slaves, and he's clear around, like, they won't some of these slave owners, they won't permit any type of marriage or anything, and yet they claim that it's that all of these African Americans are savage, despite the fact that they refuse to allow them to become married. He's particularly good where he talks about what happens at Christmas. And so he talks about between Christmas and New Year, so that 1 week, it's sort of like this holiday for, on many plantations. And he goes on, look, the reason they do this is so that it's sort of like a pressure valve so that they don't have a rebellion or an insurrection. And then he goes further. So he advances, here's what happens. How great, they get a week's holiday after spending the entire year working. Again, a myth. He then advances, he dispels the myth sort of logically and says, well, of course, what the heck would you expect? It's the equivalent of breads and circuses. This is how they make sure that, that things don't get too hopeless so that they lash out. He goes, it's worse than that. Because the slave owners, like, try to create drinking contests or eating contests or different things, and they place bets around it to encourage, like, this massive revelry week, and then say to the slaves, like, oh, look how sick all of you were after this, like, it's probably better if we just get back to work. So again, it's clinical. He talks about his own development of literacy, which is incredible. He learned a couple of letters from, and how to read just a little bit from a female slave owner he had when he was living in Baltimore as a boy. He then, she was told, you can't, if you give them an inch, they'll take an L. N-words were used in that, in the book. He then goes and he gets bread from the house, and he'll bribe young like white children around the neighborhoods in Baltimore when he's running an errand to teach him how to read just a few more words. And so Douglas's like initiative and courage and intellect are just incredible. How he learns to write, though, was one that, like, as much as I was horrified by this, there are aspects of Douglas's humanity and spirit that you just like went like yes to. So he learns to write. He's working a shipyard and he sees a couple of letters, like, starboard. For the starboard side, they'll do an S. So he learned like 4 or 6 letters. He would then go around and with a piece of chalk when running an errand, and he would challenge white children like, "I bet I can write more letters than you." And they go, "No, you can't." "Yeah, I can." And he goes, "Watch." And he would write, the letters he knew. And they would say, "Well, look, I can write more than that." And he would, "Well, how did you make that letter? Show me that again." Oh. Well, now he's got another letter in his arsenal. Say, I know more how to write more letters than you. That's how he learned to write. Like, what an incredible person. So he became literate, and he became literate just before Nat Turner's 1831 attempt to, end slavery, and in which, many people died, including pretty much all of the slaves who were involved in Nat Turner. After that, new rules and sort of policies were were implemented that would have made it almost impossible for any slave to become literate at that time. They weren't no longer were slave-like churches able to have slaves, lead the worship service at that point. I mean, talk about a First Amendment violation. There had to be white people, like, even at leading the worship service, or class leaders in a Bible class, and they wouldn't be taught to learn how to read the Bible. They would simply have the Bible read to them. And so Douglas was doing all of this right at a time, right where it was possible to do that, before like that final generation of slavery in the United States became really truly horrifying, because very deeply draconian policies were implemented on top of what was already, a massive crime against humanity, to try to prevent any type of try to make sure that slaves would never be like smart enough to lead a rebellion again. So Douglas does all of this. There's another really powerful part where he's a teenager. He's like 16 years old at the time, and he is hired out to a man who's famous for breaking slaves and basically torturing them until they finally, will give in and do what they're told. And he talks about a time where he realized, okay, like, I'm not going to stand for this. And so he fights back. And he actually fights, like, the slave overseer he's been rented to. And there's this perception there of, like, this is live or die for Douglas. Like, if, he could be killed right here. And there are 2 incidents where a slave is just flat out murdered by a white, slave owner or individual. Just flat out murdered, and nothing can happen. So a slave could not give testimony. Unless a white person gave testimony, no crime would be considered to have occurred. So Douglas talks about how he fought for his life, and from that would no longer be, the slave overseer that year did not want to publicize the fact that Douglas wasn't, being whipped and tortured, because he had his reputation as the guy who does that to protect. And so Douglas always describes it to Providence of, like, this happened and this could have gone really bad for me, but here's what happened. He plans an escape attempt, and the entire group is, hauled off to jail and beaten. He later is sent back to Baltimore, kind of to get him away from the other slaves so that he won't lead a large escape. And from there he learns to caulk ships, and he ultimately, is able to, like, have enough things go his way where he escapes. He's very clear that this is not an escape attempt manual, because he knows that how many slave owners, slave overseers, fugitive slave hunters, how all these people want to stop the escape of slaves, and so they'll read his book and see what he's doing. He talks about he doesn't think the Underground Railroad is quite as effective, and what's interesting is his first wife actually was part of the Underground Railroad. But he talks about, like, I don't want to publicize this. He's explicit. I want the slave owners to be in the dark when they're trying to find out what's going on. He's really, really just deeply intelligent. He's very thoughtful. And he talks about one of his, and I talked about, he shows his intellect off in this, and it's very clear, like, this is an intelligent human being. He goes, talking about a plan to escape him. In coming to a fixed determination to run away, we did more than Patrick Henry, when he resolved upon liberty or death. With us, it was a doubtful liberty at most, and almost certain death if we failed. For my part, I should prefer death to hopeless bondage. And I think that kind of closes out, like, what just an absolutely incredible narrative this is. What a valuable mind we get to interact with when we read Douglas's narrative. So it's just absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend that you read it if you haven't before. Now I want to talk a little bit about the cultural context in which it's written. I'd mentioned that it's written in a time where, you know, there's a belief that slaves can't learn to write, that they lack the ability to ever develop an intellect. The policies imposed after Nat Turner's rebellion would seem to contradict that. However, nationally, the national consciousness at this time, you have a president, James K. Polk, who's just been inaugurated in 1845 from Tennessee, an acolyte of Andrew Jackson. The outgoing president, John Tyler, first president to succeed to the presidency from the vice presidency, is from Virginia, and later on, 15 years later, actively joins and supports the slave-owning insurrection that is the Confederacy. He served in its Congress. He was elected to its Congress. Before that, so if you go back to 1837 to 1840, the Vice President of the United States is Richard Mentor Johnson under Martin Van Buren. Johnson introduces into Washington society his two daughters that he's had by one of his slaves. So to suggest that people weren't aware of what was going on, or that people... By the way, Johnson, of course, scandalizes everyone with this. They're scandalized that he wants to introduce his daughters by a slave into society, not scandalized that he, you know, has daughters by a slave. He was not reelected vice president. So that's sort of the cultural context of what's going on. It's like everybody who's in a position of power and in the know knows that these things are happening. It's very explicit. And so Douglas confronts all of that with this book, and I think he does it in a really marvelous, valuable way. I was appreciative of that, you know, that I took the time to reread it because of how much it continues to clarify so many of those myths that still get, you know, pushed out in the United States today. Two books that sort of jump to mind. One is, of course, Toni Morrison's Beloved, which, you know, is fictional but set, you know, in that era of slavery and the aftermath of slavery, and just how horrifying all of that truly was. And a great book if you've never read it. And then Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, in part because of the way that there are aspects of the book that I think Ellison crafts to sort of almost be this you know, the invisibility, this sense of being a fugitive, of trying to disappear from the society that can be dangerous towards you. So again, both great novels. But highly recommend Frederick Douglass. I'm going to try to find, I may have said this earlier, I'm going to try to find a PDF and link it in the video. So let me know if you've read it. Let me know if you have thoughts on it. So I hope you have a good weekend. Thanks.